So this next section of lecture one, we're going to talk about the history of microbiology. A lot of classes, it's the whole first lecture. They talk a lot about it. Most students don't care. The history is schmistery. I think it's not the best way to teach. And so we're just going to give a little bit though, because I think it's important to talk about it, but it's not a lot. Don't worry, you're not responsible for a lot of this. So people didn't know about microbes. They didn't know they existed. They were invisible until relatively recently, until the invention of the microscope. But people knew about them. Even though they couldn't see them, they knew they've been using them since prehistory. People use microbes to ferment foods. Think about all of the fermented foods out there, from yogurts to kimchi. That's all microbes doing the fermentation. Wine, beer, all that stuff. It's microbes. And people knew how to ferment foods before they knew the microbes were doing it. So people use microbes. Also, people use early biological warfare or germ warfare. Long before people knew of the germ theory of disease, the Hittites, which was an ancient civilization on the Anatolian Peninsula, which is what is now Turkey, I think contemporary with like the Pharaonic Egypt, they knew people were sick with tularemia, so they would send these tularemia patients into the enemy lands to spread the disease. So people, even though people didn't know that the microbes were causing the disease, they would use microbes against their enemies. Okay, so there's two examples of ancient people using microbes long before microbiology. Okay. Another thing that we can talk about here in the history is the microscope, right? We can't talk about the history of microbiology without talking about the microscope. Developed in was now the Netherlands in the late 16th century, originally developed by people who worked with cloth, and they wanted to look at cloth very closely, to look at the thread counts in cloth. But then people started using these devices to look at other stuff. Robert Hooke, Hooke's law of springs, things like that. He was the first one to look at cork cells using a compound microscope. That's where the word cells comes from Robert Hooke. He looked at the microscope, he saw all these little boxes, and he thought they were like the cells monks prayed in. And that's where the word cell comes from microbiology. And then Antoni van Leeuwenhoek, he was really probably the father of microbiology, or the parent of microbiology, because he spent a lot of time on it. He was the first one to look at sperm and all different kinds of microbes. He called them animalcules, and he made all of these drawings. So we're going back 17th century here now. The microscope, and you think he had a fancy microscope like the ones you might use in class. No, it looks something like this. It was basically a melted kind of glass ball, like a marble, and that was the lens. He could still get like 250 times magnification with these things. So it wasn't as high tech as you think. Microbes and research. Many of the landmark discoveries in biology were discovered in bacteria, right? I'm talking the fundamentals, the stuff in the textbooks, the understanding of heredity, metabolism, cellular mechanisms, replication, transcription, translation, all of this biotech, everything, all owe a debt to microbiology. Why? Because it's easier to grow bacteria than any other organism. Remember that we said they reproduce in every like 20 minutes, right? I mean, so it's fast, it's cheap. Nobody's going to protest when you spray them with bleach. All right, so it's very easy to work with bacteria, and they're very what's called tractable. Right, so people worked on bacteria to understand the basic mechanisms of biology. Then they went and applied it to human beings and things that are economically important. Okay, infectious disease caused by microbes. Now we know infectious diseases are associated with microbes, but it took a long time to develop this idea, and it met with a lot of resistance. Now, people did know in ancient times that recovery from a disease offers protection. That's where the word immunus comes from. I was exempt. If I get a disease, I often don't get it again, an infectious disease. Okay, so people had an idea, but people thought that bad smells, bad air caused disease. And there was a real big fight on this, and people fought a lot about it in the 19th century. Um, One person who fought this idea was Ignaz Semmelweis. Okay, and he worked in a hospital, and there were two maternity wards in the hospital. The one where the midwives took care of them, the patients, and the one where the doctors took care of the patients. And he was just looking at the data, and he's like, why is everybody dying in the doctor ward and not as many people dying in the midwife ward? And he's like, wow. He looked at those doctors, and they went from the morgue to the maternity ward, and they didn't wash their hands. Right. And so he was like, why don't you guys wash your hands, and maybe we'll stop killing so many people. And of course, this is the early 19th century. A gentleman's hands are never dirty. And so they didn't wash their hands. And they didn't believe him. They ridiculed him. He was fired. He was harassed. He became a drunk. He was committed to an asylum and beaten and died there. Right. So he died indirectly for the idea that germs cause disease. Of course, figured out he was right later on. So now he's a statue. But it was a sad story for him. Louis Pasteur, another person who really definitely made seminal contributions to the field of microbiology. Remember I said people thought bad smells caused disease? People also thought that organisms came from non-living things, that wine or gave birth to vinegar eels, that a shirt and a box would give rise to mice. It was called spontaneous generation. And Louis Pasteur disproved spontaneous generation. He also used attenuated strains of organisms as vaccines, where cholera, Bacillus anthracis causes anthrax, rabies. Definitely, a mid-late 19th century guy who did a lot for microbiology. So let's talk about spontaneous generation. People used to think that food spoiled because it was some part of the food that generated the organisms, that magically turned into an organism that spoiled the food. And Pasteur demonstrated that something had to be introduced from outside to get food to spoil. Okay, so how did he do this? He had these glass flasks with like meat broth in there. So it's a really rich like a food source for bacteria. And so he had two different flasks, one with a long neck, a long S-shaped neck, and one with a straight tube. And you could boil the broth in there to kill everything in it and let them sit. And the flask with the short tube, bacteria could fall in there and grow in the broth and spoil it. The flask with the long neck tube with a little S shape in it, the bacteria would get caught in the S bend here, right? So the bacteria fall in from the outside and they get stuck here. They don't fall straight in. Remember, maybe we could talk about this. You are breathing in bacteria in the air right now. The air you breathe is full of bacteria, right? And so bacteria falling in here and allowing this spoiling this broth, bacteria fall and they get stuck here. Okay, and they don't spoil the broth. And so then you could actually break this neck off and then it would spoil. Okay, this is a big deal. A big deal because people would love to be able to ship food around and things like that, right? And he was like, this is how you can ship food around. This is where the word pasteurization comes from Louis Pasteur. People want wine and beer to be good and be able to ship it around, right? You think, you talk about being a locavore. Back in the day, everything was produced locally because everything is spoiled. There was no refrigeration, no food preservation techniques beyond salting or sugaring stuff. And so it was hard to get food to travel. And the idea is fermentation we're going to talk about when yeast converts sugar to alcohol. We want that. I want that booze. But I don't want the bacteria converting the alcohol to acids. I don't want to do that a lot. That's where your sours come from. Your sour beers is actually a little bit of bacterial fermentation there. So Pasteur was like, well, why don't we heat and boil these things to kill the bacteria? That's where pasteurization comes from. I'm going to heat the liquid, the milk, the beer, the wine, or whatever, kill the bacteria in there, and then seal it off. And it's pasteurized, and it won't spoil. The germ theory of infectious disease. Okay, this was a big one. And the idea that infectious diseases are caused not by bad smells, but by microbes, aka germs. And eventually people accepted this idea. Like I said, it took a lot of fighting in the 19th century for people to say this was real. And almost immediately afterward, marketers were like, well, if you, now we're afraid of germs, we're going to sell things to us that kill germs, right? Almost immediately afterwards, you see Clorox, you see these companies, oh, if you're dirty, you're going to get sick and die. And this is not the case at all. Now, first we were too dirty and people were dying. Now we're too clean and people are sick and dying. Okay, so there's a sweet spot in there. As Aristotle said, virtue finds the mean. Okay, so living with too many microbes makes you sick. Living with too few microbes also makes you sick. This is called the hygiene hypothesis, an idea that many current immune disorders are the result of a lack of exposure to microbes during childhood. Now we're too clean. Also, I know cesarean sections save lives, but they also deprive you of microbial exposure at a critical point in your life. So the hygiene hypothesis is also called the lost friends hypothesis. It is the idea that the human immune system needs exposure to microbes during childhood for normal development. Remember, we evolved to live in a dirty microbial world. If you take that away, we don't develop normally. Right? If you're too clean, you're going to have allergies and other disorders, right? So you can't be too dirty, you can't be too clean. Honestly, this is a tough one, right? How do you find the middle there? People don't know that yet, but this is a very important concept. Don't be too dirty, don't be too clean.